The following tutorial is one of a series of videos that will demonstrate how to incorporate the Python scripting language into your ArcGIS processes. We will eventually review a series of videos about how you actually integrate Python scripting with ArcGIS. But before we come to that point, I want to take some time to review some basic concepts, syntax, language structure, and other elements of Python scripting so that integrating into ArcGIS is not so abrupt and so that everyone can get a little bit more of a comprehensive understanding. I'll start each of the Python videos with a quick disclaimer. I am by no means a coder or a programmer. I learned Python within the context of ArcGIS about 3 or 4 years ago, and since that point I have tried to teach myself a little bit broader applications of the language and tried to dive into it a little bit deeper so that I can understand why the applications for ArcGIS were working the way that they were. So that being said, I'm hopeful that people watching these videos and these tutorials are coming at Python from the same angle that I am, and therefore can kind of connect to the methodology that I'm going to use to walk through the language. So this tutorial right here, we're going to talk about some very basic syntax, almost like the nouns that you're going to use to build your statements in Python. As we reviewed in previous videos, I'm working right here in idle. I use a Mac, so it'll be slightly different if you don't use a Mac, but ultimately idle is a graphical user interface. It's a way of looking at your Python language and running your Python programs that's pretty self-explanatory and easy to understand. I'm in the shell, which is kind of an interactive coding environment. It's going to be used so that we can demonstrate things and we can see the results on the fly. As I start this video, I'm going to throw a couple concepts that are almost like 3 or 4 steps down the road from where I want to be, but I need to introduce them now so I can demonstrate some things. The first is a function. We're going to learn more about functions as we go on, but there's one function in particular called print that's going to be pretty important to demonstrate some things. So if I said print my name, right, you can tell a lot of cool things are already starting. One, my name is in green and print is in orange. An excellent aspect of this graphical user interface is that it kind of differentiates the types of verbiage or of syntax so that you can really understand this is a function, this is a string, and so on and so forth. Right, but doing it in my one line, the kind of line that's asking me, what are you going to do with Python? Well, I want you to print Shay, and then what's the result coming down in blue? So again, the idea of a function is a little bit down the road, but I want you to be familiar with this print function. Really, all it does is it simply brings back to you whatever you type. Cool? Other thing I want to teach you is the idea of setting variables. So this isn't too far down the road. This is only 1 or 2 steps, but I'm going to do it occasionally to teach some of the basic nouns. So I just want to bring it up now. My variable, or how I like to write it, my variable. Right? Sometimes when I learned this, I always knew it was easier if you're going to use multiple words to kind of go from a lowercase to an uppercase. My variable equals that. Right, now notice it seemed like nothing happened in my interactive environment, but really what's going on behind the scenes is the word Shay, the string character Shay, is now stored in something called my variable so that I can print my variable and I know Shay. Now let's say I eventually want to save a variable called my second variable. If I don't actually set it, right, if I just think that it's going to happen, well, it gets upset with me, right? And it's essentially telling me there's no such thing as my second variable yet, right? It isn't like a word like print that has a built-in function, and it's not like my variable. You haven't actually set it to anything yet. but setting my second variable equals shay2, now I can actually print my second variable. Oops, if I could learn to spell, and something will return. Right, so that's really what I want to introduce to you there real quick, this idea of variables, that you can take, let's break it down to the basics. You can take something that comes back in regular black text, right, that almost looks like it's a reserved word, unlike everything else, it's orange or blue or green, and you can set that to something. You can set it to a string, you can set it to a number, you can set it to another function, and it'll store itself behind the scenes so that you can call it later on. So not the last time we're going to talk about variables, but as I mentioned before, I just want to introduce them before we get into our basic types of syntax. So there's 4 basic, I'll call them nouns, that I want to introduce for Python right now, and these will be kind of your basic building blocks of language. So the first is pretty easy, it's just numbers, right? Right now I'm just going to type a number, and when you type something in your interactive shell, it's going to return to you here. I could also print it, and the same result would happen. But what you can see here is, I'm doing 1, there's no quotes like I've done earlier. Talk about quotes in a second. This is an actual number, right? And a number can be an integer, or it can be a float. And numbers, right, we understand numbers. 1 plus 1, what's that? That equals 2, right? 1 times 5, that equals 5. 1.1 times 5, that equals 5.5. All right, so very basic form here. We simply have numbers. They can be stored as a integer or a float. Float meaning that they have a decimal point. As we continue to broaden our experience with Python, we'll learn about applications or mathematical applications, trigonomic applications that you can do, working with numbers. So next will be strings. Strings, something you end up using a lot, but string really is just characters that are bookended by quotations, right? So earlier I typed my name, boom, right? Between 2 quotation marks, SHEA, that equals Shay, right? So interestingly enough, these, can also be what appears to be numbers, right? That's kind of interesting here. I've typed a number in between it, and it's 1, right? So if I try to do an operation where I said 1 plus 1, it's going to get angry at me, because though they appear to be the same thing, here, using no quotations, this is an actual number, whereas here this is a string character, right? 1 is being stored almost as a piece of text, right? A piece of string character, so it has no numeric value. I can't necessarily add it to anything. There's all kinds of things that can be strings, right? A space can be a string. Weird characters can be a string here. Punctuation can be a string. And really the thing that matters is that whatever you're typing your strings as, right, I'll even name something as my string maybe. My string equals this sentence. All that matters is that you're bookending it with either double quotes or single quotes, right? My string single, oops. Oop, what'd I do? Oh, that's why. Foolish Shay, right? Accidentally did 1 quote and then 2 quotes. So I can try my string single equals that sentence. Very, very cool. So those are strings. Sometimes, right, you're going to be writing a lot of text and a lot of information. So I might say, this is the first sentence and it should go on its own line, and when I have this printed back to me, I might want it to display itself so that there's actually like a break between this line and the other. And this is one of kind of the special characters right here. If you do \n and then continue, this is the second sentence and it should go on its own line. What returns to you is just that, right? This is the first sentence. Notice there is no \n. What that's essentially done is created not necessarily a page break, but a line break here, right? So that stops here and then it goes on to the next line. The third data type is a list, and that's pretty much what you imagine it being. It's just a series of other objects, right? So a list could be a series of numbers, a list could be a series of string characters, and a list could be a series of both, right? How you identify a list is with brackets. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, and notice what will return to me is that same sequence, bracketed here, with a comma designating each element within that list. To make it easier, I'll say my list, right, equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right, now that's stored behind the scenes, so if I need to print my list, I can print my list, right? So it stores objects in a sequence, and this is pretty handy, right? Lists and their cousin that we'll introduce next, called tuples, end up being a pretty powerful element in Python. They allow us to organize objects, they organize integers, organize string characters in a certain sequence, and then call them later depending on their order. Lists, and their cousin tuples that I'll talk about in a minute are interesting in that you don't have to have one kind of thing, right? There's an integer, there's string, there's an integer, there's string, and they can exist harmoniously here, right? Kind of cool there, right? I had my list up here, and I did my list down here with something different, and it overwrote it. And so that's something important to keep in mind too. That just kind of came up while I was teaching this. But you can rewrite a variable at any time. Back to the matter at hand, notice that my list now has specified up here it is a combination of integers, string, integers, and string. Briefly, I'm going to jump to something called methods, which are sort of like built-in functions that allow you to modify lists or integers or strings. We'll learn these in greater depth later, but just like print, I'm going to bring one in now to demonstrate a point. You do not need to leave this tutorial knowing the method I'm teaching. Understand that we'll review it in greater detail later. I'm introducing something to show that lists can be modified. That is one of the big differences between lists and their cousin tuple. And what I mean by that, right, is, let's make this easier again. I'm going to redo my list, and my list is going to equal 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I'm going to do a method here that's called append, right? Really what I'm saying here is, hey, my list, which is a variable that I stored up here, append to that list 5. Whoops, running low on battery here. Happened behind the scenes. I say print my list, and there you can see 5 is now appended to the end of my list, right? So I can delete from a list, I can insert, I can append. Lists are mutable. Their cousins are called tuples, and they are not mutable. And this is a pretty key distinction between a list and between a tuple, and it's a pretty important one too. So I'll say my tuple. Big difference between, my apologies, my tuple equals. Big difference when you're setting up the syntax is tuples use parentheses. I'll repeat, tuples use parentheses, lists use brackets. Right, so 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'll say print my tuple. Right? I'm going to use another function here called type. Just asking Python to remind me, hey, what is the type of object of my tuple? And it'll say, why, it is in fact a tuple. Right? I'll say, what's the type of my list? why it is in fact a list. Right? So I have a tuple that I know is actually a tuple. That's really what it is. It's encased by parentheses, and it holds the following integers, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, just like my list earlier, I want to take that and I want to append to it 5, and it's going to get pissed. Right? And anything I try to do here, any kind of replacement or insertion or pendants, yada, 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 tuple's not going to have it. And the reason is that a tuple has a fixed positioning. And I want to use a real quick example to demonstrate why right here. I'm going to jump almost like 50 steps ahead just to show something here. I'm going to import what's called a module. We'll work with modules later. I'm going to import one called time, right? For the sake of where we are right now, just consider a module is it's almost like an update to your dictionary. If your dictionary right now consists of 10 words, a module brings in 100 more words that you can use to use very specific things. Right, so I have my time function, and I'm really quick just going to call something with my time. I'm going to call time, and I'm going to call, excuse me a moment, forgetting the exact time I want to call. Yeah, time I want to call local time. Oh, that's neat. Right, if you pause for a second, you get all the little methods that you can call. All right, time, local time. Anytime I run something like that, it's just kind of reminding me, hey, if you want to call that method, right, on time, these are the things that you can call. So we'll dive into stuff like this a little bit later, but really what I want you to understand here is if I'm calling local time, the structure that's returning is a tuple, as evidenced by here. And you can see that the first element in the tuple is 2016. That's the year. And the next element in the tuple is 1, and that's the month, January. And the next element is the day, and that's January 12th. Right? As you can tell, I'm burning the midnight oil here. We're at 2 in the morning. We'll go so on and so on and so on. So a tuple is built in such a way that it calls sequences of integers or sequences of string values or other objects, but it calls them in such a way that regardless of how you want to use them, it knows you don't ever want to mess with the order. And that's critical, right? Because if 10 to 15 to 30 to 1,000 different people, oh dear, we must finish this one quick, are calling a tuple that has information about the time of the year, it's confusing, right, if people are switching this around and some people are saying, well, the year should go second and the month should go first, and someone else is saying, no, the day should go first and then the month, right? If you're not really sure what the structure of it is, you might accidentally be building a script that tries to call the second, right, element within a tuple, and you think that's the month, but someone has built their own crazy weird list about time structure, and the second thing is like the minute. Right? So that's the purpose of a tuple. It has a fixed sequence such that any time you call a tuple, this tuple in fact local time, and you call the second item in that tuple, it will always be the month. The third will always be the day. The first will always be the year. Versus a list when what came first, second, third, and fourth is mutable and could be changed at any time.